Some mornings, anxiety arrives before the light. The heart races, the mind tightens like a drawn wire, and the world suddenly feels like a corridor of invisible threats. Nothing specific has gone wrong, yet the body responds as if danger waits at every corner. This is not weakness. It is the modern nervous system stretched beyond its natural limits, living inside a society that never truly pauses. At a deeper level, this anxiety does not come from circumstances themselves, but from a quiet, persistent belief that everything must remain under control. When life refuses to obey, the mind resists, and anxiety arises as an alarm that never shuts off. This pattern has repeated across generations. People suffer not because of events, but because of the judgments they attach to those events. And here, a turning point appears, not escape, not suppression of emotion, but the discipline of clearly distinguishing what lies within our control from what does not. When that distinction becomes clear, anxiety begins to lose its authority. Not because the world has changed, but because the way we stand within it has. As this distinction begins to take shape, a quiet shift occurs within. The mind stops chasing every worst-case scenario that has not yet happened. Instead, it learns to step back, to observe, and to ask a single stabilizing question. What is truly within my control right now? Much of anxiety dissolves at that moment, because people are often exhausted not by action, but by carrying what was never theirs to carry. In modern life, pressure is often disguised as expectation. You must succeed on schedule. You must remain strong without hesitation. You must prove your worth every single day. When these expectations become the only measure, the mind enters a state of constant vigilance. Anxiety then ceases to be a passing reaction and becomes a persistent background condition. The wisdom of Stoic thought does not demand emotional numbness. It asks for inner discipline, to accept that certain forces cannot be prevented, while recognizing that our response to them is always a choice. When response is returned to its proper place, energy no longer leaks into panic. It is gradually transformed into steadiness, one step, one breath at a time. And within that steadiness, a person is no longer driven by anxiety but begins to lead himself instead. But that steadiness does not arrive as a miracle. It is forged in ordinary moments, when bad news appears on a phone screen, when the body is exhausted, yet the mind insists on pushing forward. When the fear of being left behind whispers that stopping means losing everything. At this point, people often resist. They mistake calmness for surrender. And that misunderstanding is precisely what feeds anxiety. Stoic discipline moves in the opposite direction. It teaches direct engagement with emotion, without allowing emotion to take the wheel. Anxiety is acknowledged as a signal, not a command. When that signal appears, the old reflex is panic. The new reflex is observation. What is this feeling trying to communicate? And is it exaggerating reality? Here, a very quiet form of freedom is born. Freedom does not mean the absence of anxiety. It means no longer being unconsciously driven by it. When action comes from deliberate choice rather than frantic reaction, a person begins to feel the weight of their feet on the ground again, and from that grounded position, no matter how chaotic life becomes, it can no longer carry them away. When the feet are firmly on the ground, a subtle shift takes place in how the world is perceived. What once felt like failure begins to reveal itself as information. Judgments that once cut deeply are now heard as passing noise rather than suspended verdicts. At this stage, a person no longer confuses self-worth with outcomes, and it is precisely this separation that deprives anxiety of the fuel it needs to ignite. In today's society, anxiety is accelerated by speed. Everything demands now, immediately, without delay. Stoic discipline places a conscious barrier in front of that current. It reminds us that the natural rhythm of a human being does not match the rhythm of an algorithm. When we allow ourselves to move at our own pace, pressure diminishes, not because expectations disappear, but because the mind stops self-punishment. Some days, anxiety returns. That does not signal failure. It is simply a reminder to return to principle. Focus on the task at hand, act with integrity, and allow what lies beyond your control to remain where it belongs. It is this patient repetition that builds quiet strength, a strength that does not shout, yet remains steady enough to stand in the midst of a noisy world. At this point, a quiet question begins to surface in the mind. If anxiety is no longer in control, then what keeps a person standing? The answer is not found in bursts of motivation or fleeting inspiration. It lives in character. In choosing to do what is right, even when no one is watching. In the ability to keep promises made to oneself, especially on the most exhausting days. Stoic discipline does not offer an easier life. It offers a stable axis. When the outer world turns chaotic, that axis prevents the inner world from collapsing. When loss occurs, pain is allowed to exist, but despair is not fed. This distinction is subtle, yet it marks the line between those who are submerged by anxiety and those who move through it without losing themselves. And in that moment, something profound becomes clear. Peace is not the reward for avoiding life, but the outcome of engaging with life from a position of maturity. When people stop demanding that life be safe, they begin to grow steady. And that steadiness, paradoxically, is precisely what causes anxiety to gradually loosen its grip. At this final point, the question is no longer about controlling anxiety, but about forming a new relationship with life itself. A person stops asking when anxiety will disappear and instead asks how they will stand when it appears. That shift in questioning opens a deeper level of maturity. Anxiety is no longer an enemy. It becomes a test of whether the inner world is clear enough to remain faithful to its values. Within a Stoic way of living, every small action becomes an anchor, doing the work that must be done, speaking what must be said, preserving dignity even in uncertainty. Not because success is guaranteed, but because this is a way of living that does not invite shame when one looks back. And strangely enough, when integrity becomes the center, anxiety loses its right to shout. It lowers its voice, and then it steps aside. If what you've heard has touched something honest within you, allow yourself to stay with these reflections a little longer. Consider subscribing to the channel as a quiet commitment, a commitment to continue strengthening the inner life amid a noisy world, not letting anxiety choose the direction, but consciously choosing your own path instead.